You think silence makes an avoidant calm down? But silence is actually the moment their mind gets the loudest. They assume you're pulling away on purpose. Avoidants hate emotional pressure. But when you finally stop trying, they suddenly feel like they're being punished. They read your silence as a strategy, not a boundary. And this is the moment the avoidant mind spirals in ways you'd never expect. Because when you go quiet, they don't think, maybe they're tired. They think they're doing exactly what I feared, leaving me on purpose. Avoidants live in a world where distance feels safer than closeness, yet the second you stop reaching for them, they start sensing danger. Your silence becomes a message, even if it's not the one you intended. They assume you're withdrawing out of resentment, out of disappointment, out of some hidden anger you never expressed. In their world, silence is not a pause, it's a countdown. What makes it even more ironic is that avoidants are masters of silence themselves. They pull back, they retreat, they shut down when things get overwhelming. But when you do it, it hits differently. It hits deep. Suddenly, they're aware of the very same void they created, and they don't know how to process the feeling of being on the receiving end. Your absence forces them to face a truth they've spent years running from. Connection actually mattered more to them than they admitted. When you go silent, they replay every conversation they avoided, every moment you opened up and they didn't, every small thing you ever asked for that they brushed aside. They wonder if you finally reached your breaking point, if you finally got exhausted from trying to love someone who only knew how to love from a distance. And that fear doesn't show up loudly. It shows up quietly in the late night thinking, the overanalyzing, the sudden urge to check your social media, the hovering over your name without messaging you. Avoidance won't reach out immediately. Pride and fear hold their tongue. They convince themselves that you're doing this intentionally, testing them, pushing them, tricking them into reacting. So they wait, they watch, they monitor the silence like it's some kind of emotional trap. But under that surface level defensiveness lies something far more human: concern. They won't admit it, but silence from someone they once felt safe with feels like emotional gravity. They can't ignore it no matter how hard they try. Eventually, the assumptions grow into a bigger fear. What if they're not pulling away on purpose? What if they're actually done? That thought is the one that finally rattles them, because avoidance can handle arguments, distance, confusion, but they can't handle finality. They can't handle the idea that someone who cared for them might be gone for real this time. Your silence becomes a mirror that exposes their own behavior back to them. How often they disappeared, how often they left you hanging without explanation, how often they made you feel exactly what they're feeling now. And that's the twist. Your silence doesn't punish an avoidant, it awakens them. It forces them to confront the truth they avoided for far too long, that losing you scares them more than closeness ever did. Deep down, avoidants carry a quiet belief that they're too much trouble, even if they never say it out loud. They live with a constant background fear that anyone who gets close to them will eventually see all the things they desperately try to hide: how they shut down under pressure, how they struggle to express affection, how intimacy makes them freeze instead of soften. So when you go silent, even if your intention is to protect your peace, they don't interpret it as distance. They interpret it as discovery. To them, your silence feels like the moment you finally saw behind the curtain. They think you've put the pieces together: the mixed signals, the disappearing acts, the emotional hesitations, the inconsistency that never fully made sense. And instead of assuming you're hurt or needing space, they assume something far more personal and far more painful: that you're realizing they're not worth the emotional investment. This belief doesn't come from arrogance or self-centeredness. It comes from years of feeling like there's something inherently wrong with the way they love. Avoidants often grew up believing that their needs were unacceptable or burdensome, so they learned to hide them, suppress them, or pretend they didn't care at all. But silence makes them think you finally noticed. They don't fear losing you because they never cared. They fear losing you because they think you finally understand who they really are beneath the calm exterior. Your distance becomes proof of what they've always suspected: that once someone sees their emotional limitations, they will eventually leave. The irony is that avoidants often act as if they don't need anyone, yet your silence awakens a fear they work so hard to bury: the fear of being fully seen and silently rejected. They won't tell you this, They won't say, "Your silence makes me feel like I'm too flawed to love." Instead, they retreat further into themselves. They overthink quietly. They check old conversations. They replay moments. They remember the times they pushed you away and tell themselves, "This is exactly why people don't stay." And though they won't admit it, the idea of you finally understanding their flaws feels more threatening than any argument ever could. Arguments can be repaired. Silence feels final. And here's the painful paradox. Avoidants often push people away to avoid being judged, yet your silence makes them believe the judgment has already happened. They think you've reached the conclusion they always feared you would, that being with them is exhausting, confusing, or emotionally draining. They assume your silence is a realization, not a reaction, and while they may act indifferent, inside they're wrestling with a quiet panic. Did they finally see the real me and decide they deserve better? To them, your withdrawal isn't just a shift in behavior. It's a mirror they've spent their whole life avoiding, and it reflects every flaw they've tried so hard to keep hidden. Avoidance won't say it out loud, but the moment you go silent, their mind goes somewhere they never admit. Comparison, the kind they pretend they're above, the kind they hide under a calm, detached exterior that looks untouched but actually hides a storm they don't know how to regulate. The truth is, avoidants compare themselves constantly, not because they think they're better, but because deep down they fear they're not enough. And your silence, the same silence they once thought they wanted, suddenly becomes the perfect breeding ground for every insecurity they've tried to outrun. They start imagining someone else, someone more affectionate, more available, more emotionally steady, walking into the space they pushed you away from. Someone who doesn't flinch at connection, someone who doesn't tense up at vulnerability, someone who isn't scared of being loved. And the ironic twist, they were the ones who needed distance. But now your distance feels like danger. They wonder if you're laughing with someone new, replying faster to someone else, offering the warmth they never knew how to receive to someone who doesn't hesitate to take it. They imagine you opening up to someone who actually listens, who doesn't run, who doesn't need space every time emotions get real. And they fear it, not because they're possessive, but because it forces them to face something they've avoided their whole life. The idea that love doesn't wait forever. And then the self-blame kicks in. They replay every moment where they withdrew, every time they acted uninterested, every time they pushed you back just because closeness scared them. They remember the texts they left unanswered, the affection they brushed off, the conversations they shut down. Suddenly, the silence isn't peaceful. It's loud, loud enough for them to hear the truth they've been avoiding. You could have chosen them, but they gave you every reason not to. And now your quiet becomes a mirror, one they can't look away from. They wonder if this new person would appreciate the things they never acknowledged, if someone else would treat the feelings they took lightly with real care, if someone else would show up in ways they never learned how to. And beneath all of that comparison is a terrifying thought. They refuse to voice. What if someone else gives you what I was too afraid to give? That thought alone is enough to shake them. Because avoidants aren't emotionless. They're terrified of losing something real before they're brave enough to hold it properly. And your silence feels like the kind of loss they can't control, the kind that happens quietly without a fight in the spaces where they used to believe they were safe. They won't chase loudly. They'll never tell you this. But inside, the fear is real. Someone else is taking the spot they didn't know they wanted until it started slipping away. Avoidants don't chase, but silence turns their mind into a replay machine. They can't switch off. When you go quiet, they suddenly become hyper aware of every tiny detail they usually brush off. They'll replay the last conversation in their head like a scene on loop, searching for hidden meanings, missed signals, or something they said that might have landed wrong. They won't reach out and ask, that would require vulnerability. So they retreat inward instead, dissecting every word, tone, and pause with surgical precision. The irony is that avoidants often appear calm, detached, or even unbothered on the surface. But inside, your silence activates a level of introspection they never willingly choose. They start wondering, did I seem disinterested? Was I too cold? Did I dismiss something important? Did they expect more from me and I missed it? They'll analyze moments you already forgot about, but for them, those details now feel heavy, almost incriminating. And because avoidants fear emotional exposure, they don't know how to reach out and clarify, so they sit alone with their thoughts, spiraling quietly. What makes this moment intense for them is the contrast. Avoidants are used to the other person doing the emotional work. They're used to you initiating, bridging the gaps, smoothing the silence. So when that disappears, They're forced to confront something they've avoided for years, accountability for how their behavior affects the people they care about. Suddenly, they're questioning themselves in ways they rarely do. Was I too distant? Did I shut down too fast? Did I minimize their feelings? They begin wondering whether we've finally grown tired of their emotional walls and whether the silence is the first sign that you're slipping out of their life. They won't say it aloud, but the thought grips them tight. Even the most confident avoidant is vulnerable in this moment. They may start checking your social media quietly, trying to see if something changed. They may read your last message multiple times, focusing on a single emoji or tone, convincing themselves that there was a hidden message of disappointment in your words. They might even consider texting you, not to open up, but to test the waters, to see if you still reply the way you used to. But the fear of appearing needy usually stops them. So they remain silent, battling their own assumptions, hoping you'll take the first step and relieve the pressure they're too afraid to confront directly. And the most revealing part is this: avoidants don't replay conversations unless they care. Their minds don't go into this depth for someone who didn't matter. Your silence forces them to face emotions they've tried to outrun. It creates a crack in the emotional armor they spent their whole life building. This isn't just overthinking, it's a quiet admission that losing your presence would hurt more than they ever expected. Avoidants do not handle emotional uncertainty well. And when the person they quietly rely on goes silent, something unsettling happens inside them, something they never confess, but always feel. Your silence doesn't register as space or calm or taking a moment for yourself. To them, it feels like a quiet breakup, a soft, slow fading they can't stop, but also don't know how to interrupt. Avoidants grow up expecting emotional endings to happen without warning. So when you step back, even for your own peace, they assume it's the beginning of the end. They don't think maybe they're overwhelmed, or maybe they just need a breather. Their mind jumps straight to loss, finality, abandonment wrapped in politeness, and it stings in a way they never show. In their inner world, endings are something you survive by disconnecting early. So when your voice disappears, they slip into an emotional limbo, half expecting a goodbye, half pretending they're unfazed. And yet, underneath that calm surface is a pull, a tension, a sinking sensation that whispers, "This is it. They're done with me." What makes it more painful is that they believe they caused it, even when you haven't said a word. Even when your silence is simply rest, recovery, or boundaries. Avoidants assume emotional responsibility in the most self-critical way, believing they said too little, offered too little, cared too little, or pushed too hard. They go through their mental checklist, pinpoint the exact moment the dynamic shifted. They relive conversations, small misunderstandings, moments when they pulled back out of fear, all the tiny things they never explained, now haunting them. And because avoidants don't know how to initiate emotional repair, your silence feels like a door they aren't allowed to knock on. They want to reach out, but they're terrified the response will confirm their greatest fear, that you've already moved on emotionally, and they're the only ones still lingering in the aftermath. This fear keeps them frozen, not chasing, not asking, not clarifying, just quietly bracing for an ending they believe you have already decided on. There's also a hidden irony in all of this. Avoidants often fear emotional dependence. Yet when someone they trust goes silent, it exposes just how much they've come to rely on your presence. Not loudly, not obviously, but in the quiet ways, your consistency, your tone, the feeling of being chosen, even when they pretended not to care. So when that presence disappears, even slightly, the void feels bigger than they expect. They assume your heart is closing, your patience has run out, your attachment is loosening, and instead of reaching toward you, they retreat further into themselves, convinced they're protecting both of you from an uncomfortable conversation. Your silence might simply be space. To them, it feels like conclusion. And even though they won't say it out loud, the fear that you're emotionally done becomes the story they tell themselves long before you ever do. Avoidance might be the first to pull away, but nothing rattles them quite like silence, because silence feels like a mirror being held up to their own patterns. The moment you stop reaching out, they begin wondering if this is some kind of emotional test, a hidden challenge meant to force them into proving how much they care. And this thought terrifies them more than losing control or losing connection itself. Because for an avoidant, being tested means being judged. It means being expected to perform emotionally on demand. It means being pushed into a space where they feel like they can only fail. So instead of stepping closer, their entire system goes into defense mode. They start scanning the situation through their typical avoidant logic. Why now? Why the silence? What changed? Are they seeing if I'll do what they always wanted? And that last question, do they want me to chase, is the one that hits the hardest. Because chasing feels unsafe to them. Chasing feels like surrendering their autonomy. Chasing feels like stepping into a vulnerability they've spent their whole life avoiding. And yet, part of them wants to. A quiet, hidden part of them wants to bridge the gap, wants to reach out, wants to break their own rule of staying distant. But the fear of doing it wrong keeps them frozen in place. So they overthink instead of acting. They imagine you sitting there waiting to see whether they'll step up. They imagine you testing their attachment, their commitment, their interest. They imagine you silently evaluating their next move, and it puts pressure on a wound they rarely show, the fear of failing someone who actually mattered to them. And because emotional pressure shuts them down, they retreat even more, convincing themselves that staying silent is safer than risking the wrong gesture. They tell themselves that if they reach out and you were testing them, you'll think they're needy. But if they don't reach out and you weren't testing them, they'll look cold. It becomes a lose-lose scenario in their mind. And yet, underneath that panic, something deeper brews, the realization that your silence affects them more than they want to admit. They don't obsess over people they don't care about. They don't analyze silence from someone who didn't matter. So the fact that they're even thinking this much is proof of something they won't say out loud. Your distance means something to them, enough to trigger fear. Enough to create confusion, enough to make them feel cornered by feelings they never intended to develop. So they sit in that paralysis, caught between wanting to reach out and feeling unable to move, wanting to break the silence and fearing what the silence represents, wondering whether this moment is the beginning of the end or a lesson they're supposed to learn. And the whole time, they're hoping you understand something they can't articulate. They're not ignoring you to hurt you. They're frozen because they're afraid that whatever they do next will expose just how deeply they actually feel. When you go silent, an avoidant won't show it on the outside, but internally, something deep and old gets triggered, a quiet unraveling they don't know how to name. Silence doesn't make them feel in control. It doesn't make them feel powerful or superior. It makes them feel small. Suddenly, every insecurity they've spent years burying starts to surface. They begin wondering if your silence is proof of what they always feared, that they were never in the first place. Avoidants pretend they don't care about being valued, but the truth is the opposite. They care so much that it overwhelms them. So instead of leaning in, they protect themselves by leaning away. But when communication stops, that shield cracks. They start questioning whether your distance is a reflection of their worth. Did I push too hard? Or maybe I didn't give enough. Maybe someone better, someone more emotionally available, more stable, more patient, finally replaced me. They don't say it out loud, but the thought becomes a quiet background noise in their mind. This is the moment they compare themselves to every person you've ever known. They don't see themselves as someone worth waiting for. They see themselves as a burden, too complicated, too guarded, too unpredictable. And silence for them feels like confirmation. Even if you weren't trying to send a message, they read one anyway. Their brain fills the blanks with the harshest interpretations, not because of you, but because they've carried this wound long before you came into their life. Growing up, emotional closeness may have felt unsafe or overwhelming. They learn to detach as a survival strategy, but that same strategy becomes their downfall in relationships. The more they avoid connection, the more they fear losing it. Your silence activates that paradox. They think, if I mattered, they'd still be here, but they don't realize your silence isn't abandonment. It's exhaustion. It's a boundary they don't know how to interpret. What hurts them isn't the silence itself, it's what they think the silence means. They imagine you getting tired of waiting for them to open up. They imagine you seeing through the tough exterior and realizing there isn't much safety behind it. They imagine you finally understanding their detachment for what it is, fear dressed as independence. And the worst part, they think you leaving would make sense. That's the internal narrative they've lived with for years, that people leave once they see the real them. Avoidants don't break loudly, they collapse quietly, internally, in the places no one else can see. And your silence becomes a mirror. They can't avoid anymore. It doesn't show who they truly are. It shows who they fear they are. In those moments, they don't just question the relationship, they question their value, their desirability, their enoughness. Your silence becomes the trigger for their oldest belief. If they really knew me, they'd leave too. Avoidance spend most of the relationship convincing themselves that they don't need anything from anyone. It's their shield, their survival strategy, their way of staying in control of emotions that often feel overwhelming. But when you go silent, truly silent, not in anger, but in calm detachment, something unexpected begins to happen inside them. The comfort they once dismissed as nice but unnecessary suddenly becomes the very thing they find themselves craving, not loudly, not openly, but in the quiet spaces where their defenses can't protect them. Your silence exposes something avoidance tried desperately to hide. They got used to you, to your tone, to your check-ins, to the way you made emotional closeness feel less threatening, even if they never admitted it. Avoidants are experts at underplaying their attachments, but they are not immune to them. So when the familiar warmth disappears, they feel the absence like a missing heartbeat. They won't say it, but they notice everything. The empty notifications, the quiet phone, the lack of your presence in their daily routine. And for someone who has spent years believing they function best alone, the realization hits deeper than they expect. At first, they tell themselves you're just busy. Then they convince themselves they don't care. But silence stretches time for avoidance. With no messages to respond to, no emotional cues to manage, their mind fills the space with the memories they tried to suppress. They start remembering the conversations that comforted them, the reassurance they pretended they didn't need but leaned on silently, your voice, your perspective, the way you softened the edges of their fear. It all floods back. They won't admit this to you, and at first, they won't even admit it to themselves. What makes this moment powerful is that your silence doesn't pressure them. There's no demand, no expectation, no emotional weight. And ironically, that's what reveals how much they depended on your presence. Avoidants always run from an ain't, but they gravitate toward consistency. When that consistency disappears, they don't feel abandoned. They feel unanchored. Something stable is gone, and the world feels slightly out of balance. This is when the truth surfaces. They miss the emotional connection. They minimized. Your check-ins weren't too much. Your affection wasn't pressure. Your presence wasn't intrusive. Those were their defenses speaking. But the person beneath the armor, the one who's terrified of needing anyone, felt comforted by you, safe with you, regulated by your steadiness in a way they can't quite replicate alone. So your silence becomes a mirror. It reflects back the attachment they've been avoiding. It shows them what your presence actually meant. And while they may not reach out, may not break the pattern, may not chase, they feel every inch of the distance, quietly, deeply, persistently. They start missing the warmth they claimed they didn't need. And that's the paradox. Avoidants don't realize the value of emotional comfort until it disappears and leaves them sitting with a longing they don't know how to name. Avoidants rely on patterns. They rely on rhythms they never admit out loud. And the biggest rhythm of all, the one they depend on more than anything, is the belief that you will always be the one who comes back, no matter how far they retreat, no matter how cold they become, no matter how many walls they stack between you. They rely on your persistence. Like oxygen, they pretend they don't need. So when you finally go silent, truly silent, not to provoke a reaction, but because you're tired, drained, or simply done trying, something inside them shifts in a way they are completely unprepared for. Your silence becomes more than a pause. It becomes a pattern breaker, a threat to the dynamic they were sure would never change. And that's when the fear creeps in, quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. What if this time they actually won't come back? At first, they try to convince themselves it's temporary. They tell themselves you're busy, distracted, or giving them space, something they always claim to want. They tell themselves the cycle is still intact, that you always come back, that they've never had to be the one to initiate anything. But as the hours stretch into days and you still don't reach out, something much deeper starts to unravel. Avoidants pride themselves on being self-sufficient, but the truth is emotional patterns give them a sense of control. And when the pattern suddenly disappears, they're left with a feeling they spend their whole lives trying to avoid helplessness. Your silence doesn't just disrupt communication, it disrupts their belief that they can stay distant without consequence. Suddenly, they find themselves wondering if you've hit your limit, if maybe this time the emotional cost became too high. If maybe this time you're thinking about your own needs instead of chasing theirs. And that thought terrifies them more than conflict, more than intimacy, more than vulnerability, because avoidants expect others to try harder to prove themselves, to show unwavering loyalty, but they never expect the other person to walk away. Your silence becomes the first real sign that you're no longer willing to accept crumbs. It becomes evidence that you're healing or growing or reclaiming yourself in ways that don't include waiting for them to choose you. And that's when their avoided confidence, the coolness, the detachment, the emotional distance begins to crack, not loudly, not visibly, but quietly, internally, in the space where their fears live. They start questioning whether they pushed too far, withdrew too long, or took your consistency for granted. For the first time, they consider that you might be choosing peace over persistence, clarity over confusion, self-respect over emotional limbo. And that's the moment avoidants secretly dread, the realization that the person who always stayed might finally be the one walking away. Your silence becomes their wake-up call, not because you intended it to be, but because for the first time, they're forced to face a truth they've avoided. Their entire life cycles break when people do, and they are no longer certain you're willing to rebuild this one. Avoidants don't react to silence instantly. They react when it finally hits them. That silence feels safer to you than they do. When the silence finally sinks in, it lands differently for an avoidant. Not as a message you're sending, but as a mirror they've been trying to avoid for years. At first, they tell themselves you're busy, distracted, or simply taking space. That explanation feels safe, manageable. But as the hours turn into days, the quiet starts reshaping their entire internal narrative. It moves from they're just taking time to the far more unsettling truth. They're choosing distance over me. And that's the moment everything inside them begins to unravel in ways no one ever sees. Avoidants don't fear loneliness the way others do. They've lived in it. They've built homes inside emotional distance, but the silence you give them isn't loneliness. It's clarity, and clarity terrifies them. It forces them to notice how easily you can detach, how peaceful your absence feels compared to the emotional work their presence required. They start asking themselves questions they've spent most of their life refusing to consider. Did I make it too hard? Did I push too far? Did they finally realize I'm not worth staying for? Each question cuts deeper because it's one they've asked silently long before you ever came into their life. And that's the irony. Avoidants often believe they're protecting themselves by keeping relationships at arm's length. Yet your silence becomes the very thing that exposes how fragile that distance truly is. They begin replaying every moment they brushed off your affection, every time they hid behind excuses, every instant they withdrew instead of leaning in. They thought their detachment was a shield. Now it feels like the reason you stopped trying. What hurts the most isn't your absence. It's the possibility that you found peace without them, that your world didn't collapse when theirs quietly began to. They wonder if your silence means you finally matched their emotional distance, or worse, that you've outgrown it. Avoidants don't chase when you disappear, but they do spiral in the shadows. They question their worth, their choices, and the cycle they once assumed you'd never walk away from. And when the realization hits, that silence now feels safer to you than they ever did. It breaks something deep inside them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet internal way that stays with them far longer than they'll ever admit. Because for an avoidant, losing emotional safety is one thing. Losing the person who offered it is another. That's the real mic drop moment. Not when you go silent, but when they finally understand why.